Hello. This is actually quite an important video. Seems like all the videos I like, people don't like. And the videos that well, it's kind of, even after 7,700 videos, it's over 7,000, I never make videos in hopes that, ooh, I'm going to get a bunch of clicks out of this. I make videos about important topics, and I especially do love to talk about stuff that no one else is talking about. By the way, here's an example. This is made out of Python. I actually made this last night. There you go. It's actually ultra slim, but it's made with real Python. Yeah, I got a 16-foot Python. You can't see it. It's over there. 16-foot roll. Well, I should call it a roll. It's a 16-foot Python. It's not like you go to the grocery store and you buy rolls of Python. That is like a $600 roll of python hide. Quite expensive. There's an interesting video. It's been on YouTube for years. It's actually on Massachusetts Institute of Technology's website. And it's called, type in MIT, which of course is short for Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Type in MIT, the dissectable capacitor. There's actually a glass beaker, and there's a copper sleeve halfway on the outside of the beaker and halfway on the inside of the beaker. And then there's a metal prong that actually hangs over the ball, and it'll actually charge it up because it's basically a battery, and you could dissect it. They call it a dissectable capacitor, but it's just a battery. And they charge it up with a electrostatic generator. And then they discharge it. You can actually see it arcing. It's like, well, sure, it's the electrons between the copper plates. And of course, they never explain the video. It's just like 2 minutes long. And then they charge it up again since they just discharged it. And then they take the pieces apart. They by hand, you take the copper sleeve off the bottom of the glass jar. And then the copper sleeve on the inside of the glass jar, they separate them. And then, of course, they're knocking the two different copper pieces together, and of course there's no discharge. Because glass is a dielectric. By the way, you can actually type in dielectric capacitor. And this is all about counterspace, which is kind of a rather silly word, and I've actually said that from day one, but there's this psychosis, and this is what Oliver Heaviside, too, called it. He called it a psychosis, that power was only flowing, or actually flowing, through the copper lines, like in your power lines in your backyard, and that's not the case. There's actually a conjugate field between the two. And then, of course, you can actually take a copper coil and charge your cell phone or whatnot off of power lines, but that should not be done because that's incredibly dangerous, and you could actually have an enormous amount of power arc over. But the point being that the idea that that we think that trillions of little electrons are flowing through the power lines in your backyard. Everybody's been brainwashed that way. Because modern science, and this is not my opinion, sees it that, and they will say that outright, every one of them will, that the flow of power is the flow of electrons. They don't know anything about dielectrics, and they don't know anything about the conjugate field. You could go type in like glass capacitor. I don't know if you know what a capacitor is. I certainly hope you do. Anyway, like in the MIT dissectable capacitor, they try to discharge the metal once they've charged it up. And of course, there is no discharge. So they reassemble it with the glass and the copper sleeve on the outside and the copper sleeve on the inside. Just watch the video. It's only 2 minutes long. And you can see that the charge, of course, the capacitance that gets discharged is in the glass. The glass is a dielectric. Yeah. If it's clear, it's a dielectric capacitor. If it's actually shiny, i.e. metal, it's a dielectric reflector. And there's this conjugate system relationship between the magnetic field and the dielectric field. And we have one of capacitance and induction. And of course, there's a distinction between, of course, voltage, which is equal to dielectricity, and amperage, which is equal to magnetism. Magnetism is specifically the toroidal geometry of force, and dielectricity is the hyperboloidal. And here I have a little hyperboloid, and it's just a little egg timer. That's the geometry of a hyperboloid there, of increasing inertia and acceleration. And there are a lot of, I've been attacked endlessly, and I didn't come up with this word. I point out there's like 4 different books on COUNTERSPACE, and a few videos ago I was showing you where those are at. But I'd like to give you a couple other analogies, and I'd actually like to go over, what COUNTERSPACE means. And before any of these extremely unintelligent, intellectual, shallow people, throw shade on the idea of counterspace, what they don't understand is the conjugate relationship that makes up electricity. And these are from the actual gods of field theory themselves: Tesla, Faraday, Steinmetz, Heaviside, and James Clerk Maxwell. These people gave us 95% of the systems that we use today. But we can think in terms of counterspace in countless different ways, and everybody's heard of a ground. Here's the little electrical symbol for a ground, and of course it could be electrical ground, it could be an aerial ground, or it could be a chassis ground. You got a ground in your car, otherwise your electrical system doesn't work properly. Of course it grounds in your chassis, but here's, of course, an electrical. What did you think counterspace was other than a discharge node for power? Instead of saying counterspace, I couldn't care less, neither does nature care, obviously so, what terminology it is that we use. You say ground, and you say counterspace. What did you think a black hole was? I've been talking about these endlessly. Now, it's not a hole, and of course it's black because it's not a light emitter. But it's a supermass with no magnitude. This conjugate interplay between magnetism and dielectricity, which are the yin and the yang of the entire universe, when something attains to a point source, then it becomes a supermass so large. And by the way, the only reason why anything has a footprint in this universe, in other words, the mass and magnitude of an atom, and of course, conglomerately so of an atom, we have matter, right? Everything, of course, is a compound of hydrogen, and is a harmonic thereof of hydrogen. The only reason any atom with its enormous footprint, and of course the nucleus is extremely tiny inside, is due to magnetism only. Well, if you have a mass so large that dielectricity overthrows magnetism, then what you have is something that human beings can't wrap their mind around. That's a supermass with no magnitude. Because mass, i.e. the atom, and in the case of matter, whether it be hydrogen or helium or rocks or anything, only exists due to magnetism. When magnetism has been overthrown, then you have something supermassive with no magnitude, which human beings have a really hard time wrapping their brain around. I mean, they really do. I'm going to quote Eric Dollard. No, I don't need to quote Dollard on this, but whatever you think of him one way or another, and I'm really, other than his books, which I've recommended, I am definitely no fan of his. I spent some time with him a few years ago at the Science and Energy Conference, but I wouldn't want to spend any more time with him. But I'll quote him in accurately stating, this is his quote: "In order to understand electricity, you have to understand, have an understanding of counterspace. Otherwise, it's impossible." And he didn't come up with that. It's this conjugate relationship that makes up electricity from someone actually far more intelligent than Nikola Tesla, and that is Charles Proteus Steinmetz. Whatever you, and I love Tesla, and I've studied his writings endlessly. Charles Proteus Steinmetz is incredibly intelligent, an enormous amount of patents, and he's the one that actually perfected the AC generator of Nikola Tesla. J.J. Thompson, we don't have to use the word counterspace, which people have ridden me endlessly that have no idea what they're talking about. For using the term counterspace, J.J. Thompson called counterspace, his idea in his own head, intermolecular dimension. This is just J.J. Thompson's way of saying counterspace. This is Charles Proteus Steinmetz from Electrical Discharges, Waves, and Impulses. The magnetic and the dielectric field of the conductors are both included in the terms the electric field, and the two components thereof of the electric field. We all, due to our materialistic / atomistic ideas, think that electrons are flowing in the power lines outside the back of our house. You can take any, oh, look, we had Wi-Fi issue. My Wi-Fi router has been going on and off all day, so my fire is frozen. But that's okay. We'll continue on even though the fire is frozen. Since glass is a capacitor, as in the case of the video, MIT, the dissectable capacitor, if you actually place a volume of glass, not that you should do that because it's extremely dangerous, between two power lines, the glass will actually absorb an enormous amount of dielectric induction. It will become a battery, and if it actually... Here's another question. Back when they actually put glass insulators on power poles back in the day, remember that? You're not old enough to remember that. You sell them everywhere at antique stores. Yeah. If they got hit by lightning, or if the power went out and it went back on when the electric grid was not that super reliable, they would get a surge of dielectric voltage along the power lines. And what would happen then is that the glass would reach capacitance, and the glass on the power lines, they're blue and green glass, or all sorts of pretty colors, they would explode. Glass is a capacitor. Now, the wires pass around the glass insulators so that the charge on the power lines, both then and now, would not discharge into the ground. There wouldn't be loss of energy. But if it spiked, the voltage spiked, then the glass would blow. How do you explain wireless power induction? You cannot understand electricity, which is not an autonomous phenomenon. Phi times psi equals Q in Planck of electrification. The cross-multiplicative energy phenomena that we call electricity is the byproduct of dielectricity and magnetism. Those are not my words. Those are the words of Charles Proteus Steinmetz and countless others. What do you think a discharge is? Do you know what a cold cathode effect is? What do you think the distinction between charge and discharge is? It's not a negative charge. It's a discharge node. What do you think a ground is? Instead of saying counterspace, do you want to use the word ground? Do you want to say discharge node? Now, a discharge node is always the antithesis of a Cartesian vector. And a Cartesian vector is not multiplicatives of space, rather a direction and a location with an x, y, z coordinate. Counterspace is not some idea that I came up with. It is the necessary principle of understanding the nature of both fields and what electricity is, and also, too, the conjugate principles of that which makes up electricity, which is dielectricity and magnetism. Here we go, Charles Proteus Steinmetz, also too, electrical discharges, waves, and impulses. Many textbooks speak of the electrical charges on the conductor and the energy stored by them without considering the dielectric energy is not on the conductor, but in the space outside of, he means between, the space outside of the conductor, just as is also the magnetic energy or amperage. Unfortunately, to a large extent, this is also too C.P. Steinmetz, in dealing with dielectric fields, the prehistoric concept, and this book is from 1917, concept of the electrostatic charge or the electron on the conductor still exists, and with its use destroys the analogy between the two components of the electric field, that being the magnetic and the dielectric. This makes the consideration of dielectric and magnetic fields unnecessarily complicated. If you actually understand this conjugate relationship, explaining an electromagnet to a child becomes infinitely easier. This is a quote, I can't remember if it's from Dollard or not. It says, electricity is not a place for physicists. Physicists, of course, I mean atomism. They have this idea that there's this charge-carrying particle and it flows through wires. Well, I don't have my clamp meter. It's actually right over here. I should actually grab my clamp meter. Let me go do this. This is... Oh, here's another question. It's kind of a how do you catch a physicist? There's two different ways. There's actually a lot of different ways. One of them, you ask them, how does wireless power induction, because I always tell you that the movement of power is the flow of electrons. There's nothing in between there, especially in a vacuum. So how does wireless power induction, Mr. PhD, pseudo-intellectual prissy pants? And they don't have an answer. It's like, it's okay not to know. But stop telling me that you think electricity is a singular entity, which it's not. I mean, these are the gods of field theory. Yeah, they tell you flat out. Tesla said it, Steinmetz said it, Dollard said it, that the flow of power, i.e. electricity, is not the flow of electrons. And the principle of electron is accurately described and defined by its so-called discoverer, J.J. Thompson, who called it 1 unit of dielectric induction. Now here's a clamp meter. You actually have to separate out the positive and the negatives. You actually take, determine how much amperage is used by your device. You can plug your computer, whatever the heck you want. In the back here, actually this goes into the wall. Your device goes here, and all this does is actually split out your feeds on your 2 wires that's feeding your device, and you take your clamp meter. Now there's nothing touching here. You know, if it's so simple, and nobody ever answers this. We ask them, it's so simple, it will trick them. You actually place this around the side, and it will tell you here on your clamp meter how much current your device is drawing. So like determining, you know, your electrical box for, you know, how much is your AC sucking, how much power is it sucking off the wall, or your computer, whatever the hell it is. You just plug this into the wall or your power socket, and then you plug your device over here, whatever it is, microwaves, anything. You just put your clamp meter around it, and it will tell you right here. Now this is not touching, this is just plastic to plastic. I could actually hover it to where it's not touching at all. Yeah? So if electricity were the flow of electrons, then it would be passing through the wire that's located in the center of this plastic. I mean, so what do you think this is measuring? Well, it's measuring lines of force in the field. There's a little sensor right here, which you can actually almost see it. There's a little bump right there. I thought you said electricity was the flow of electrons. There's nothing flowing between this piece of plastic and the plastic, which is not connected out here. And if I were able to put this in a vacuum chamber, it would still read exactly the same. I said, I thought you said the flow of electricity. Also, too, if an inductance line is the flow of electrons, then why doesn't it run out of? Because it's like a tube of toothpaste. You can only squeeze the tube of toothpaste for so long until you run out of toothpaste, right? They will tell you that, like, you have a big set of copper cables come off of a large AC manifestor, which is what normal people call an AC generator. It doesn't actually generate power, it manifests power, because it's an arch form. That's what an AC generator is. You know, from these people's own mentality, they will tell you that there's electrons flowing. When the AC generator kicks up, you know, you have kinetic energy input, and you have the arch form going, you know, it's feeding power to whatever it is you want to feed, and electrons are flowing from point A at the generator to wherever it is you want to send the power to. It's like, they're basically telling you that it's a bottomless tube of toothpaste. It's like, don't you say that electricity was the flow of electrons? How is it that you're not running out of electrons at the point source there? They never have an answer to that. They don't. It's because their brain is locked into this atomistic idea of energy. And they think it's about electrons, and they think electricity is, this is electricity, it's one thing. Electricity is not one thing. It's a conjugate relationship, and you cannot. Dollard's not the only one that says this. He got this idea from Heaviside and Steinmetz. Understand electricity without understanding its conjugate nature, and you also, too, can never understand electrical theory without understanding counterspace. If you want to say ground, or you want to say discharge node, who cares? It's counterspace, I've said since day one, sounds a little bit kind of like, you know, counterspace, like the counterspace inside your kitchen. You know, just suspend your sense of humor for a second here. Magnetism is spatial. Dielectricity is counterspatial. Dielectricity lives in counterspace. The closer the 2 wires of a circuit are, the more counterspace, the more dielectricity you can store. By the way, on AC power lines, if you increase the voltage, the power lines will swing together. If you increase the amperage, i.e. magnetism, they'll spread apart. The smaller the space, the higher the capacitance. Capacitance is directly relational to counterspace and to dielectricity. Magnetism is a spatial vector, of course, centrifugal, force and motion. The wider apart the wires, the more magnetism you can store, and of course the dimensional expression is inductance as measured in amperage. Okay? Capacitance and induction, of course, are real. These are engendered forces and inertia. This is written forces, which tend to increase, of course, their own space. Capacitance wants to pull the wires closer, thus increasing counterspace to make room for more dielectricity, or more voltage. And inductance, of course, i.e. magnetism, pushes them apart, and increases to make room for more magnetism, i.e. amperage. The fault of these mathematicians is they want to conflate a coordinate system, i.e. a spatial dimension, which is a location. A coordinate is an instruction. Go to XYZ coordinate relative to where you are. It's not a dimension. A coordinate is an instruction, not a dimension. And of course the number of the coordinates depends on the geometry used. But no matter what the geometry, it is always of one space, i.e. spatial. A coordinate, it's like, well, XYZ coordinate, there's length, width, and depth. Those are multiple vectors of space. It's like, no, that's a direction. That's one space. There's only two dimensions in the entire universe, spatial and counter space. The length, width, and depth are not three different dimensions. There is only spatial and counter spatial. Mother Nature, being the hairy armpit chick with grass or hemp skirt and muddy feet, doesn't deal in multiple different spatial dimensions. There's only two dimensions. Dimensional and anti-dimensional. If you want to say anti-dimensional instead of counter space, who cares? The principle being referred to by myself is not one of my own making, and I don't care how much you laugh. I have the facts, logic, reason, and evidences behind me. I have them. The people that are, poo-pooing the idea of counter space, if you want to say interdimensionality or anti-dimensional or non-Cartesian or anti-Cartesianal, I don't care what term you use. You want to say ground? That's fine. We have the vector of magnitude and we have the vector of ground. We have a discharge node or we have a ground. Counter space, dielectric. The smaller the space, the higher the capacitance. That's contrary to humans, which only think in terms of spatial. That would be the same distinction between physics and metaphysics. Metaphysics is just a fancy word for saying counter space, or anti-dimensional, or non-Cartesian, or anti-Cartesian, or saying, the ground that makes things possible, the substrate, the foundation, which makes everything else possible. Nihil ex nihilo, from nothing comes nothing, but there's two different types of darkness, by the way. There's the darkness of the unmanifest, and there's the darkness of rest, i.e. inertia, pure potential. It boggles my mind, but of course I think in a different way, and I actually have poured my brain over the deeper aspects of physics and metaphysics and field theory, which are all one and the same thing. Field theory, metaphysics, and all of this is just one giant lump with different impressions in it. Counter space, we could say, well, it's not real. People say, counter space isn't real. It's like, well, I almost want to agree with you, because if by real you mean demonstrable and palpable and phenomenal and spatial and dimensional, you're correct. It is not real, but not real as an imaginary like a unicorn or a leprechaun, but anti-dimensional, anti-real, or anti-phenomenal. Instead of saying real, it's not real. Just say it is non-phenomenal. We could just use the word metaphysics, say counter space. But these are the versors of space and counter space, the conjugate relationship that makes up electricity. Now, if you think you're smarter than Nikola Tesla or Charles Proteus Steinmetz, I don't care what word you want to use, but you cannot deny the principle of whatever it is you want to call it. Counter space, metaphysics, non-dimensional, anti-Cartesian, non-Cartesian. It is, well, I can't use the word real, can we? It is palpable. It is not demonstrable, and it is demonstrable in this way. Where do you think capacitance is coming from when you actually have a conjugate field and an AC power line, for example? You stick a piece of glass between it. Watch that MIT video on the dissectable capacitor, because glass is a capacitor. They used to call them dielectrics. And by the way, type in dielectric capacitor on any Google search. You'll see it. It looks like a little capacitor, except it's a clear piece of glass. It doesn't always clear, but some of them are clear. It's a clear piece of glass. Glass is a capacitor. The principle of counter space is 1000% logical, rational, and you cannot understand field theory without understanding that principle, regardless of whatever you want to call it. This is the same principle behind a ground, the same principle behind a black hole, something with no magnitude that contains a super titanic and unfathomable amount of matter. Dielectricity has overthrown it. It has no spatial or magnitudinal, XYZ spatial versor. Like it is XYZ mass with, it's 1,000,000 miles wide, a circumference is 1,000,000,000,000. No, it's none of those things. It has no magnitude, but we know the matter is there because it's influenced upon everything else. We could call a black hole a counterspatial phenomena. Human beings can't wrap their mind around that, and people have been trying to explain them for years. Of course, they're not a whole, but if you understand space and counterspace, and you understand the conjugate principle behind dielectricity and magnetism, understanding what a ground is, understanding what a black hole is, becomes extremely simple. This is the conjugate relationship of the entire universe. You see right there, of course there is a little hole there, but see right there, there's nothing at all, but there is everything. Plane of inertia, point source energy. Why is point source energy multiplicative? You can actually deny the fools that they're poo-pooing the idea of counterspace by asking this simple question. Why is it a point source energy device like a magnet or a laser, a infinite multiplicative above that of a non-point source? For example, a 5-watt laser, not that this is 5 watts, it's like 300 milliwatts, is infinitely more powerful and dangerous and useful and all sorts of things than is a 5-watt non-point source. What is it about point source? Because point source means it's emanating from counterspace. Point source energy. Everything fascinating and amazing technologically is a point source energy derivative device, whether it uses magnets or lasers. Yeah. All of this carries throughout field theory. Counterspace is real, but not in the conventional sense of real, as in demonstrable. If you can't wrap your mind around it, that's not my fault. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Thanks so much for watching.